Welcome to my new series. This is the first episode in Exploring Judaism. And we're going to take a look at what is one of the most ancient and also one of the smallest religious traditions in the world. When we talk about Judaism, one of the first things that everybody notices is that it is a monotheistic tradition. Now, of course, in religious studies, we talk about monotheism and polytheism. Monotheism implies that there is one God only, mono, whereas polytheism, poly implies many or a multitude, so there is a multitude of gods and goddesses. Well, Judaism has always stood very strongly upon this idea of monotheism, that there is one and only one God. But the question becomes, how far back can we actually trace that? We need to understand that Judaism actually arose within and contrary to the pagan cultures of the Middle East. Groups such as the Sumerians, the Persians, the Egyptians, who all practiced various forms of paganism, which of course was a polytheistic tradition filled with a pantheon of deities, gods and goddesses. And they could be seen in the forms of statues. They could be invoked by the high priests and the high priestesses. So all of these pagan traditions were prevalent in the world that Judaism is going to be born into. So what makes Judaism unique is this adherence to monotheism, the notion that there is only one God. Now, this is a concept that was expressed in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. And this particular text has become something of the watchword of Judaism, and I want to share with you this passage. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall have the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might. Take to heart these instructions with which I charge you today. Impress them upon your children, recite them when you stay at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them as a sign on your hand and let them serve as a symbol on your forehead. Inscribe them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. That was Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. And this is, again, become something of the watchword of Judaism. That line, Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord God is one. Now this Shema, it has been called the watchword of Judaism, but it's not clear that this has always been the case. In the earliest of times, the other gods were accepted, and the pronouncement was that you will follow this God alone, not that there were no other gods. Nevertheless, we're going to find that monotheism is going to win out in the end. In ancient Canaan and Israel, they recognized gods including Yahweh, El, Baal, Asherah, Anat. And if you look at the Aramaic version of Psalms 20, it gives evidence on these deities, and particularly the figure of Baal. In addition, we have looked at the study of archaeology, and in the archaeological tradition, there have been found numerous inscriptions, such as the Kuntaled Ajrud and Kirbet al-Qom, which offer evidence on Asherah as being the goddess and the consort of Yahweh. It's rather interesting that as late as Iron Age 1, there were many cults that existed to all of these different deities, and it was believed that Asherah was the female counterpart of Yahweh, just as you have within many Eastern traditions the idea that there is the male deity and the female deity. You have, for example, within the traditions of the Hindu, the Vedic culture, you have Ram, who has his female counterpart of Sita. You have Krishna, who has the female counterpart of Radha. Within the Egyptian traditions, you have this. Within many, many different pagan traditions, you have this. And it seems that in the earliest stages of what would become Judaism, you also had this idea that there was the male and the female counterpart, Asherah, the female, Yahweh, the male. When we look at the figure of El is taken to be the original God of Israel. But each deity is given its own nation, its own tribe. And if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 through 9, it says, "When the Most High, Elyon, gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated humanity, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of divine beings. For Yahweh's portion is to his people, Jacob his allotted heritage." And so it seems that in this case, Yahweh is the son of El, a very distinct deity. And as early as Genesis, chapter 49, verses 24 and 25, it already presents El as being a deity distinct from Yahweh. And so it seems in these earliest writings and in the earliest traditions that perhaps this was not a monotheistic tradition. It recognized too, just as those in the communities around it, that there was an alternative. There were other deities that existed. But the pronouncement in Deuteronomy seems to be saying originally that this is the deity. Yahweh is the one who has been proportioned or given to this people, to this group of people. This is your Lord. This is your God. And so perhaps El is the divine being who has these other figures, each one given to a different culture, each one given to a different group. But despite the evidence of this, the strive towards monotheism has already begun. If you look at Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, as well as chapter 3, verse 7, Samuel chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, and chapter 12, verse 10, they will all pit Yahweh against Baal, showing the two deities battling against each other for dominance. Judges chapter 6, verses 25 through 32, we hear about the desire to eradicate any type of devotion or worship for Baal or Asherah. And so we have to get rid of these other deities. We have to destroy them. We have to discredit them, but destroy them and get rid of them. Joshua chapter 22, verse 22 makes the proclamation, El Elohim Yahweh, the God of gods is Yahweh. And so in that text, we see the pronouncement that the ultimate God of gods is Yahweh. Now, this again could be read in the sense of saying that we're looking at monotheism, but it could also imply that of the deities, this is the one who has become dominant. This is the one who has come out on top. Now, in an attempt to eradicate the feminine and to seek monotheism, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 18, claims that Yahweh transcends all sexuality. Male and female imagery both can be used and are frequently used to refer to the one true God. So it's important for us to remember that while the Shema has become the watchword of monotheism, originally its purpose was not to say there is only one God, but rather to suggest that one God, Yahweh, is superior to all of the others. And so in this way, the Canaanites and the Israelites would worship their God rather than anyone else's. And so what I've tried to do with this little bit of history here, textual history, is to suggest that although we tend to think of Judaism as a very monotheistic faith today, the origins of it are much less sure. And so while by roughly 1000 BC, these other cults have been destroyed, or at least downplayed, and Yahweh is the dominant figure, it seems that the idea of monotheism becomes very well entrenched by the time of the unified Israel of about 1000 BC, the time of David and Solomon. And of course, from that point onwards, it remains so. But those earlier stages, those earlier days, it did seem like at least there was a different form that this faith might have taken, and that maybe it was simply a matter of one God battling against others and coming out dominant and coming out on top. Or, as indicated again in Deuteronomy, the idea that maybe this one God, this one deity, has been assigned to the people of Israel, which makes him their God as opposed to any others. So don't respect or don't look at what the other deities are saying. Look only to, your own deity. Respect only his will. Okay. So, having laid that foundation, I want to turn our attention to the holy text of Judaism, at least as we know it today, and this is what's called the Tanakh. Here you see the text itself, the Tanakh, which is the holy book of Judaism. In essence, it is the same text that you would find within the Christian Old Testament, but the order in which they're presented is different. The Tanakh is made up from the names of three specific elements. You have the Torah, the Nebim, and the Ketubim. T-N-K, Tanakh. The Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible in the same order in Judaism as we find them here within Christianity. But after that, we see a little difference. The way that the Old Testament is written, it tries to present a chronological order of what happens from the act of creation up through the process of time. It doesn't always do a very good job of that. There's a lot of repetition. There are things that are out of sequence, but it tries to give a chronological order. Instead, the way the Tanakh is presented is that it divides things up into these 3 separate areas so that it can discuss very specific topics. And so the Torah is the law. It's giving guidance, it's giving instruction, it's laying down God's law for man to follow. The Nebim are the writings of the prophets. And so the prophets of old who spoke to the people of the world, who carried on God's teaching, they are given in that second section of the Tanakh, the Nebim. And then the other writings, the more historical writings and so on, those are found within the Ketubim. Now the Torah itself is going to begin with the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis introduces God as the ultimate being, existing alone in the cosmos, but bringing all things into existence. And so this story follows the tradition of all other creation stories that we have. The story of Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 and 3 are going to lay out 2, some people argue connected, but actually 2 very different stories of the act of creation. And so I think it's important for us to remember that the writings that we're looking at in the Tanakh are writings that were orally passed down for hundreds, if not thousands of years before these writings were actually put into print. The earliest known surviving text from the Tanakh comes to us from about 500 BC, and that's the story of Job. The others are going to be transcribed, written down after the fact. And so these are stories that have been passed down from one generation to another, to another, to another, as a living history, as a living prophecy, before they're ever put down into print. And so this is why it seems that we have, for example, multiple stories of the act of creation. Now, again, some people have tried to link these things together, but it does seem fairly clear that there are two very different traditions. I want to take a look today at Genesis chapter 1. And it begins with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters." Well, the basic cosmology of man is one of the fundamental purposes of any creation myth. The account of creation put forward in Genesis 1 is very much in line with many other creation myths from around the world. The account from the Chandogya Upanishad, for example, or the Taoist creation story, is essentially the same. Words such as formless, empty, dark, void, these are commonplace in every one of these myths. And the point seems to be that originally there was only one existent thing, whether we call it God or Brahman or Tao or whatever we want to call it. There was only one thing that was there, and that everything else is going to emerge out of that one thing. Everything that will ever exist is contained within this unity, within this plenum. But yet there was no differentiation at this point. Now we see in this story what is explained much more simply in the Taoist version. The universe is a yin-yang. There is light and darkness. There's day and night. There's man and woman. There's the dualities of the finite temporal world that are all going to emerge out of that unity of the divine within God. But within the eternal, there are no dualities. There's only unity. So when God creates, that created thing differentiates itself from God. And this is when the moment of time begins. Philosophically, it's a very interesting prospect because, we run into that question of time and what is the origin, what is the start of time? If we accept the idea of creatio ex nihilo, that God created the world out of nothingness, then there was only God and nothing else. And then all of a sudden, the act of creation brings something else into existence. When God was alone, undifferentiated, there was no division. There was no separation of any kind, which means there was no way of measuring time. 100 billion years and a nanosecond are exactly the same thing in such a situation. And so there's no way of saying how long God existed before the act of creation. And that's why many theologians and philosophers have argued over the years that the creation of the universe is in many ways also the creation of God, because there's no concept of time, there is no existence of time prior to that act of creation. So that's what we take from this opening couple of verses. Verses 3 through 5 say, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day." Well, this passage is really kind of problematic, and it's been pointed out as so by a lot of people, because it seems that God creates light before there's a sun to generate that light. The sun is not created until the fourth day. Now, we could argue perhaps that verse 3 is a reference to the light of understanding, perhaps, or maybe the light of divine illumination. Even verse 4 allows for this interpretation. To separate the light from the dark would have been important as a moral interpretation, the good from the evil. But verse 5 seems to destroy that claim. Here in verse 5, we find that light refers to day and darkness refers to night, evening and morning. being specifically mentioned. Now, one may argue that to understand the course of the day, we have to also understand light and dark. Yet, there are places in the world where there is only daytime, and places where there's only night. And that undermines this argument. You look at, the upper reaches of the world, up in Lapland, for example, or the northern reaches of Canada or Alaska, and you'll find that there are long periods of time where it is completely dark, 24 hours a day, around the clock. And there are going to be other times where it's completely light around the clock, 24 hours a day. There's no differentiation of day and night in that respect. So we can try to understand, we can try to argue that we got to understand the course of the day, that light and dark are necessary to that. But the fact is that there are places where that's not the case. And so the mystery of this section remains unsolved. But we can clearly understand that it is the first dualism to emerge. The unity of opposites, the yin-yang pattern has been established, because as this act of creation comes, it's going to be a matter of differentiation. What once was that unity, what once was whole, is now being split in twain, to where we have light and dark, we have day and night, we have morning and evening, and that pattern of duality is going to continue. Verses 6 through 8. And God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault and from the water above it. And it was so. God called the vault sky. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Well, on this second day, God again produces a duality. The heavens are split from the earth. But what are we to make of the separation of the waters from the waters? On one level, we might argue that water is the most crucial element, and that without water, nothing could exist. In fact, most living things are composed of water. When we couple this with the ancient belief of the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, it seems logical that water is deemed the first and the most important element. I mean, without water, nothing could survive. There could be no life without water. In addition, we can clearly see that the world upon which we live is mostly water. And we know that water falls from the sky. The blueness of the water, the blueness of the sky, they demand comparison. Sometimes looking out to sea, we find it difficult to determine where the horizon really is. The water and the sky, they blend together so nicely. And so all of these factors help us to accept and understand this passage, I think, a little bit more fully. For example, if you do painting, you can start out, with your paints, and you're laying out on the top layer, you're laying out on the bottom layer. You might have the same blue being painted on there, being covered on there. And then you start to differentiate things with clouds. You start to draw a little pattern there of horizon. You start to make ripples and reflections in the water. And there you see that differentiation. But in the beginning, what do you have? You have blueness on the canvas. And in essence, couldn't we perhaps see that way as well, that here is this blueness, and we can see the waters of the earth, we can see the waters of the sky. Again, to think of an ancient person without any real understanding of science looking up and seeing water falling from the sky and recognizing that the sky is the same color as the water, doesn't it make sense that we would see them as being one? But then through this act of creation, they are again split asunder. Verses 9 and 10. And God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and he gathered the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So when we look to the earth itself, we find that there's another duality present. There's the water and there's the land. Now, interestingly enough, we know now that the earth was originally water, with all of the land masses joined together in one large continent that we've called Pangaea. Science tells us that the shifting of the plates caused the continental drift, which separated these land masses into two separate continents, and then later into many other different areas of land, all surrounded by water. And so, isn't it kind of interesting if we think about the world being covered in water, and then up comes this land mass that emerges through it? Well, that land mass is the separation of land from water that eventually, of course, again, through that shifting of the tectonic plates, is going to give us the world as we know it. Verses 11 through 13. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seeds in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seeds according to their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seeds in it according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. So at the end of the third day, vegetation begins to grow upon the earth. And I think it's also interesting to note that once again, when we look at evolutionary science, it is on the same page as Genesis. In fact, as we examine this document, it's pretty remarkable how closely the ancient authors of this text really were to describing what science has only in the last couple centuries come to be able to prove. Verses 14 through 19. And God said, "Let there be light in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred time and days and years. And let them be lights into the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light and to give earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So on the fourth day, God creates the heavenly bodies which shine down upon the earth from on high. We see the creation of the sun. We see the creation of the moon and other planets, the stars. So God creates these heavenly bodies on the fourth day. Now, despite 3 full days of light, only now is the sun created, the greater light to govern the day, along with the moon, the lesser light to govern the night. So it's kind of interesting, and you can see where the problem that so many people face is coming from. How do you reconcile the fact that we've already had 3 days, we've already had light for 3 days, and only now the sun and the moon are being created? Verses 20 through 23. And God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the water teems and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. So now animal life is brought into existence on the fifth day. Now, once again, science tells us that all life began in the sea. And this is exactly where Genesis is also saying life begins. The first creatures are the creatures of the sea, and then the creatures of the air. The creatures for the land are saved for the sixth day. And so again, you can go back and you can look at our record of scientific record of life on this planet. And it tells us all life begins in the sea. And so we start to get these single-celled amoebas that are brought into existence, and they develop into other beings of the sea. And eventually, after millions of years, some of these may crawl up onto land. But we see life beginning in the sea, We see life on land much, much later. Genesis is telling us the same thing that science now proclaims to be true. Verses 24 through 25. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kind, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kind. And God saw that it was good. So despite the similarities between the scientific account and the account that's given in Genesis, many people are still going to question evolution, and specifically whether the religious views and the scientific views of creation are compatible. Well, one of the great stumbling blocks is the notion of the 6 days of creation. However, it's been pointed out for thousands of years, what is to say that when it says 6 days of creation, that these are normal, everyday, 24-hour days? God is an eternal being, and there is no concept of time within eternity. So whether a day is 24 hours or 24 millennia is irrelevant. The 6 days of creation could be understood not as 24-hour human normal days, but perhaps 24 periods of creation. All right? The 6 days of creation could be 6 eras of creation. 24 hours could be 24 hours or 24 eras of creation. This account is written for people who have an average life expectancy of about 35, 40 years. Now, people of this time, they would never be able to understand the idea of millions and billions of years. I mean, it's hard enough for us to wrap our head around, and we've been playing with these scientific concepts for a long time. But how could people of the ancient world, who many of them, you had so many people dying in infancy, you have an average life expectancy of 35 to 40 years. I mean, how could these individuals end up in a situation where they could understand what it meant for something to have lasted 1 billion years? So the question is going to be put into language that they're able to understand. By making each period of time a day, the average person is going to be able to comprehend what that would imply. I understand a day, I understand a week, and I see how much I can accomplish in that time, and so now we compare that in a way with what God has done. So the average person can comprehend what they would not really be able to wrap their heads around otherwise. So evolution is actually perfectly compatible with this particular account of creation. In addition, when we consider the language, we find that evolution actually is already contained within the text. All right, it says within here, let the land produce. It says bring forth. And phrases like that really imply a form of evolutionary change. So once we move past the idea that a day has to be 24 hours, evolution seems much more likely. But there's still one further stumbling block, and probably the bigger stumbling block to this link, and that's coming up next, the creation of man. And so in verse 26, then God said, I lost my spot here, there it is. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that we may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over the creatures that move along the ground. Let us make mankind in our image. Now, these words have created a lot of difficulty, a lot of confusion over the years. If we read these words literally, then we end up with the old adage that God made man in his own image and we return the compliment. In other words, we began to think of God as being like us in a material sense, and we imagine God as an ancient old man with long, white, flowing hair and a beard who looks down upon us from on high. Well, based upon that understanding of the text, it becomes very hard to accept the idea of evolution. We might argue that to accept evolution and Genesis as being compatible, we would have to think of God as a being who began in the sea and evolved into a monkey and finally into a human form. I mean, thinking like that would be blasphemy. And so we reject the idea of evolution, saying that God made us exactly the way we are. Hence, God and man are the same. However, like most things biblical, a literal reading of this text is really going to get us into trouble. Religious language is metaphorical. It has to be understood as a metaphor, a way of helping us to understand something in a way that we can comprehend it. So he says, let us make mankind in our own image. It has to be understood in a very different way than we traditionally understand it. God is not a material being. God is spirit or soul. And likewise, mankind is in reality not a material being either. Mankind is spirit being. Because we're born into this physical world, we are given a temporary house in which to live, namely this body. But this body is not us. It's not our true nature. Our true nature is the soul that dwells inside the body, a soul which existed before birth into this world, and a body, or a soul rather, that will exist after the death of this body. In other words, like God, we are actually eternal beings. Because of this soul, we are able to rule over all things upon this earth, just as God rules over all of us. Now, a major difficulty is going to emerge at this point. The Judeo-Christian view of creation seems to indicate that only human beings possess a soul. Other creatures do not. However, since all things are created out of God, there was in the beginning nothing else, right? There was God and nothingness. All things have a part of that divine spirit within them. The animal soul may not be as developed as the human soul, but that doesn't mean that it's not there. As Aristotle indicated, the human soul is both rational and irrational, whereas the animal soul is just irrational. Yet there is that irrational component which is shared by both. And it's here that wants, appetites, desires are supposed to be found. Only human beings, however, have the rational component that allows them to override those animal instincts and seek a higher purpose. And this is the way in which human beings are made in the image of God. It's not and shouldn't be read that human beings and only human beings are divine beings that share that spark, that have a soul. That's a misinterpretation of this text. It should be seen otherwise, that all of existence shares in that divine because all of that existence was created by it. But because humans have this higher rational capacity, they are the ones who are able to seek it and to understand it. And this is the way that we become seen in the image of God, as beings who are both rational and eternal. Verse 27. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. This is a very important passage. In Genesis 1, there is no reference at all to man being created before woman. There is no inference within this of female subordination, as we find in the creation story at Genesis 2 and 3. Man and woman are created simultaneously, in keeping with that yin-yang dualities that are present in the physical world. Man and woman come into existence together as equals, both in the image of God as spirit soul beings possessing intelligence and reason, superior to the animals, but equal to each other. Right? And that's a very important point that seems to get lost in Genesis 2 and 3. Right? If you're familiar with the story, and we'll of course talk about it in the next episode, but Adam and Eve, right? Adam is created first, Eve comes later. Eve is to be a helpmate for Adam. She is inferior to him. And so we get this concept of female inferiority and male superiority that's brought into that. But in Genesis 1, it's not there. It's not found. It's kind of interesting to note that in regards to this passage, and with the desire to make the first 3 chapters of Genesis seem like a coherent story, when, again, it seems pretty obvious that they're separate, a lot of the writers of the Jewish Midrash helped to create the story of Lilith. As Adam is taken to be the first man, under this Jewish Midrash, Lilith becomes the first woman. Now, of course, this is problematic because in Hebrew, Adama is not a reference to a single man, Adam, but rather it's the word for mankind in general. And it's very evident as we translate this that the Adama is not Adam, man, a single person that is created, but is mankind in general. But this Midrash says that Adam and Lilith are created as the first man and the woman. In other words, they are created as the two equals that are brought into existence. They are equal. But Lilith, we're told, wants to lie on top of Adam during the act of making love. And Adam feels this is wrong, and he complains to God about this. And so God casts Lilith out of the garden and creates Eve from Adam's rib as a subordinate, as a helpmate, and as a servant of Adam. And you see, this is what happens, is that these medieval Jewish rabbis are trying to make sense of how we can have 2 very different stories of creation. How can one say that man and woman are brought into existence equally, the other one that they are brought in unequally? And so they come up with this story of Lilith, and we see Lilith as being this powerful and domineering figure. Interestingly enough, too, Lilith goes on to become a very powerful symbol of feminism, and also a very important figure in a lot of modern pagan beliefs and traditions. Verse 28, God helped them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Well, this passage has led us to vast difficulties between the peoples of the earth. In primal traditions and in the Eastern traditions that grew out of them, the earth is seen as the mother. The earth is to be worshipped, to be loved, to be protected. We don't own the earth. We don't own any part of it. Rather, the earth is granted by loving and compassionate, is granted in this loving and compassionate way by God for the benefit and the use of everyone who inhabit it. However, according to this passage, humans are not merely a part of the natural world. Humans are superior to the natural world, and they have a claim to it. Humans are to lord over the earth and to make it work for their own purposes, to make it work for humankind. This was actually one of the central problems when Europeans came to the Americas. The native populations didn't really understand this concept of owning land. So when the Europeans offered payment in exchange for the land, the natives understood this as an offering of peace. It was sort of like they're saying, well, we wish to share this land with you. We want to hunt its game with you. And the natives, they could not really enter into a contract to sell off the land because their understanding of it is that the land belongs to Wankantanka, belongs to God. So how could we sell off a land that doesn't belong to them? But the Europeans were following this pronouncement from Genesis. They were firmly entrenched in the belief that it was perfectly legitimate. The land can be parceled out. It can be owned by human beings. The plant life, the animal life, the mineral wealth that comes from it, it's all there to be exploited for the benefit of the owner at the expense of all others. And so it is this passage at Genesis 1:28 that is the justification to the greed and all the other unethical activities of the Western world. It's also this passage which caused humans to believe themselves to be superior to, rather than part of, nature. And that makes the acceptance of the evolutionary theory very difficult for Western believers. Verse 29. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, and they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath and life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. Well, here's something that almost entirely missed Western readers. Believers of this faith were meant to be vegetarians, not meat eaters. God gives all the plant life on the earth to man as his food. In addition, God grants plant life as food for all the other creatures of the earth. There is no justification here for animal to eat animal, but rather all creatures were to feast upon the abundant plant life that was provided. Yet meat has become a staple of many wild beasts in the world, including human beings. So why do Westerners pick and choose from their text? Why does one so firmly accept that man has the right to exploit nature for his own personal gain and reject that one should not eat flesh? Is the inconsistency in this text, or is the inconsistency in the believer? Well, it's not as easy as that. Because, of course, it seems quite obvious here at verse 29 that we are not meant to consume flesh, that we're not meant to kill and eat animals, that we are meant to eat the abundant plant life that's been provided for us. And we can certainly see in human physiognomy that human beings are actually better geared towards being vegetarians than they are being carnivores. However, as we read on through the text, we'll find that while it says here in Genesis 29 about the vegetation, later on in many other passages, we find instructions on these are the types of foods that you're allowed to eat. This is the way it needs to be prepared. This is the proper way to offer it for sacrifice. And so the text changes. Just as we're going to see a change between Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 over how creation was brought into existence. We're also going to see differences in the rules that are being provided. Again, why does this happen? Probably it has a lot to do with the fact that these are, again, oral traditions passed down over time. That when these texts are written down, they are not written down all at once as a complete coherent whole. But you're getting this story coming in and this story coming in, and it's only later that you're going to have these scribes and rabbis and scholars and high priests who start to put the things together into a form that we recognize now, and that's why it seems there's so much inconsistency there. And so finally, verse 31, God saw that all he had made, and it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Now notice that in Genesis 1, there's no mention of a seventh day. There's no mention of a day of rest. Only the 6 days of creation. The second generation creation story is actually going to begin at Genesis 2:4. But verses 1 through 3 of Genesis 2 are going to be added later by a different hand in an attempt to create the impression of a coherent story. But there's no evidence that existed of any type of activity on the seventh day of the week. And so it was surmised that God, a being of endless energy, ability, spirit, he simply rested. And so this established the notion of a holy day every week and the opportunity to take a rest from the endless toil of the world that we live in. And so starting with our next episode, we'll go ahead and take a look at the second creation story at Genesis 2 and 3.